Today, I finally want to tell you about one of the most distinguished veterans of the American fleet, the battleship USS Texas. Its fate largely mirrors the legendary path of the British battleship HMS Warspite. The USS Texas is the only American ship that managed to serve in all theaters of war of its time. It participated in battles in North Africa, supported the Allied landings in Normandy, led vital convoys across the Atlantic, and even shelled Japanese positions on Okinawa. And all this despite also participating in the First World War and even supporting the operation to capture Veracruz as early as 1914. In fact, Texas managed to take part in practically all major conflicts where naval power played a key role. At the time of its launch on the 18th of May, 1912, this battleship truly possessed the most powerful artillery. It can be safely said that, excluding its New York-class sisters, the USS Texas was one of the most powerful ships in the world at that time. Interestingly, it was initially designed with two main armament options, either 12 inches, 305 millimeters, or 14 inches, 356 millimeters. It already belonged to the next generation, the so-called super dreadnoughts. After all, the first British dreadnought, which gave its name to the entire class, already looked less impressive by then. The New York class embodied much later technical solutions as the development of naval technology at that time was progressing by leaps and bounds. The initial design, with 12-inch 305mm guns, was essentially a somewhat improved and enlarged version of the Wyoming-class battleships. But when it came to the final drawings, it became clear that the new 14-inch 356mm guns had successfully passed all tests and were ready for installation on the ships. That is why the initial design with 12-inch 305mm guns was finally abandoned, and the option with 10 14-inch 356mm guns was approved. So, funds for construction were allocated in 1911, and on the 17th of April of the same year, this incredible ship was laid down. Its appearance, of course, did not go unnoticed. When the Americans laid down their battleship USS New York, the Japanese immediately learned about it. In response to American battleships such as New York and Texas itself, they created their Fuso-class ships, Fuso and Yamashiro. Although Fuso entered service 1 year later than Texas, and in 1915 it briefly seized the title of the world's most powerful ship, our story today is about Texas. The construction cost of the USS Texas at that time was almost $11 million. By modern standards, this might seem like a trifle, but back then it was simply an enormous amount of money. Imagine, one shot from its main 14-inch 356mm guns cost the taxpayer $777. This is truly an impressive figure, showing the colossal cost of such a military giant. The ship had a fairly significant displacement for its time. Its full displacement in later stages of service, already during the war, reached almost 29,000 tons. The USS Texas, like most American battleships of that era, was relatively short. What did this mean? A short hull usually implies lower maximum speed but significantly better maneuverability. In the American fleet, there was a principle that all battleships should have approximately the same turning radius and similar speed. This allowed them to maneuver synchronously without dividing the fleet into fast and slow squadrons, as happened, for example, in Japan, where battleships like Fuso and Kongo could have a speed difference of up to 5 knots. This is an important detail in tactics. The USS Texas's armor scheme was implemented using a method that later became unconventional, but for its time was quite standard. Its protection was distributed throughout the entire ship, including the extremities, in contrast to the all-or-nothing principle, which involved concentrating armor only on the vital citadel. Essentially, the Texas in this sense differed little from its dreadnought predecessors or any other ships of that era. There was a core principle. The armor had to protect the ship from shells of the same caliber as its own armament. That is, if the guns were 356 millimeters or 14 inches, then the armor had to withstand hits of the same caliber. The torpedo protection at the beginning of its service was not overly powerful. However, it is worth remembering that in 1912 to 1915, torpedoes were quite primitive, weak, and had a very limited range. Therefore, for that time, the torpedo protection was entirely adequate. Of course, by World War II standards, it was absolutely insufficient, and it was significantly improved throughout the ship's service. Nevertheless, for its era, it was very good, and only German ships at that time could boast better protection. But the true star, in my opinion, was its power plant. The USS Texas was equipped with vertical 4-cylinder triple expansion engines. These engines, each developing up to 14,000 horsepower, became some of the most modern and advanced steam engines ever created in the world. Their sophistication was so impressive that they served for the entire 32-year service life of the USS Texas. Almost all original parts, including cylinders and pistons, remained native. Only the most insignificant elements were replaced. This is simply an amazing story of engineering skill and durability. The steam engine itself was a marvel of engineering thought, the embodiment of perfection for its time. Initially, their boilers ran on coal. Over time, they switched to mixed fuel and then entirely to fuel oil. It is worth noting that with liquid fuel oil, to cover 1 mile at a speed of 6 to 7 knots, which was considered the most economical speed, required 222 liters of fuel, or 59 US gallons. Of course, in addition to mechanical power, the ship also needed electrical equipment. For this purpose, powerful generators capable of producing 300 kilowatts of electricity were installed on board. This was quite a lot, considering they provided the standard voltage of 120 volts, characteristic of American electrical grids of that time. The steering gears were double, an electric rudder and a steam-driven rudder. The electric one was usually used because it was very convenient. One could simply set the desired turning angle, and the rudder would automatically execute it, turning the ship. However, the steam system was constantly kept ready, just in case of a power outage. Furthermore, there was also a manual rudder control, although it's hard to imagine the superhuman effort required to turn a rudder with an area of several square meters or dozens of square feet using a helm. The ship's crew size underwent significant changes. Initially, during the era of coal-fired boilers, an extremely large number of stokers were required. Their number, along with engineers, reached up to 400 people. With the transition to fuel oil, the need for such a large number of stokers diminished. However, the overall crew composition still expanded significantly. This was due to the placement of a marine detachment on board for landing operations and the strengthening of anti-aircraft armament, which required a large number of service personnel. In the 1930s, the crew size increased from 1,000 to 1,300 people, and during the war, at certain times, it reached almost 2,000. This meant that the ship accommodated a huge number of people. Of course, they had to be packed in, and even officers eventually occupied less space, although there were not many of them. For sailors, cabins and berthing spaces were arranged wherever possible, even using rooms that became available after modernization. The ship's armament also underwent significant changes. At least 7 major stages of modernization are documented, during which its combat power was substantially altered and strengthened. Upon its entry into service, this ship had impressive secondary artillery, 21 guns of 5 inches caliber. This was a standard anti-destroyer battery designed to fight destroyers, not the mines themselves, which is important to understand. The main caliber, however, consisted of 10 Mark I guns of 14 inches caliber. Of course, there were also anti-aircraft mounts, but to be honest, at that time they were not particularly effective. Even torpedo tubes were on board, though, by the way, they were dismantled sometime in 1927, as they proved unnecessary for a battleship. Some of the most extensive modernizations the battleship underwent began in the late 1920s. At that time, some of the secondary artillery was removed and much else was added. But already throughout the 1930s, the ship was actively strengthened with anti-aircraft artillery, which reached its peak, of course, by the end of the Second World War in 1945. This period marks the peak of its anti-aircraft armament, numerous Bofors and Oerlikon automatic cannons. By that time, there were no longer Browning machine guns of half-an-inch caliber, and 3 inches, by the way, were also not counted as purely anti-aircraft. These were dual-purpose weapons that could engage air and surface targets. Of course, a small number of 5-inch guns remained. The main caliber deserves special attention. For example, some parameters include the maximum rate of fire for these guns was approximately 1.7 rounds per minute per gun. Of course, this depended on the skill of the crew, and it is worth noting here that the battleship Texas, throughout its service, was distinguished by the extraordinary training of its artillery crews. Beginning with the First World War, it repeatedly won various competitions in the United States Navy precisely because of the quality of its firing, its accuracy, and rate of fire. One could talk at great length about all the modernizations this ship underwent. Already during the First World War, in which it managed to participate briefly starting from 1917, like many other American ships, its anti-aircraft armament was strengthened. They added 1.85-inch salute guns, which, although intended for ceremonies, were perfectly used against combat aircraft and airships. After the war, by the way, the quality of its anti-destroyer artillery was improved. But interestingly, this improvement came through reducing the number of guns, as the initial concept did not live up to the hopes placed upon it. The platform from which seaplanes were launched was removed from the ship. Although aircraft were used on battleships later on, it was closer to the end of the war. Further improvements included modifications to the main caliber's loading chambers to accommodate larger shells and launch them at greater speeds. All these improvements, in fact, are not the most interesting. You can read about them in many places. For instance, the generators were replaced, and their power increased from 300 to 400 kilowatts. From the late 1930s and early 1940s, the famous Chicago pianos were installed on it. These were 28mm anti-aircraft guns in quadruple mounts, and by 1941, 76mm guns were added to its artillery. In addition, the main caliber barrels were also reworked, at least twice. First, they were replaced from early modifications with Mark V and then with Mark X. Yes, there were certain modifications that distinguished it from other ships of the same class, but these were mostly minor details. These technological solutions, these improvements, remained in service and operated effectively until the final days of its combat career. Besides all this, it was equipped with a search radar station. This was the first American ship to participate in combat operations in the Atlantic with such a radar, which allowed it to effectively detect enemy aircraft. Overall, it possessed numerous capabilities. The catapults remained on board, and various types of aircraft were used and changed throughout its service. Interestingly, even in 1945, unmanned aerial vehicles were launched from its deck. All right, let's leave these details for later and move directly to how this ship participated in combat operations. After all, it fought, eventually, everywhere. However, the events that took place in Mexico, those related to the Mexican Revolution and the American capture of the Mexican port of Veracruz, are not the subject of our conversation today. If anyone wishes to learn more about this, specifically how the United States of America was already beginning to actively intervene in the foreign or even domestic policy of other nations in those years, there is plenty of information available. When it comes to the blockade of a certain port, I recall that many battleships participated. Among them, of course, were USS South Carolina, USS Wyoming, and many other ships, including USS Texas and USS New York. They successfully completed their mission, and the regime was overthrown. After this, USS Texas returned to service in the Atlantic Ocean in relatively peaceful waters. It was there that it participated in rescuing people from a Dutch steamer. For this heroic act, as it was the first to arrive at the scene of the disaster, the monarch of the Netherlands even presented the crew of USS Texas with a model sailing ship. This event undoubtedly brought the ship a certain degree of fame. In World War I, after the United States entered the conflict in 1917, USS Texas, like most of the American fleet, participated quite sparingly. Several ships, including USS Texas, USS New York, USS Arkansas, and USS Wyoming, made the crossing across the Atlantic Ocean. They joined the British Grand Fleet, which was temporarily based at Scapa Flow, a large natural harbor in northern Scotland. Their main task there was convoy escort. During World War I, the service of USS Texas was relatively calm. The crew spotted submarines a few times, and the ship guarded destroyers and torpedo boats while they laid minefields. Overall, these were routine tasks without significant combat engagements. Already after the victory in World War I, USS Texas participated in escorting the surrendered German fleet. It escorted these ships to Scapa Flow, where they were to be interned. However, the Germans committed an act of sabotage, scuttling most of their fleet so that it would not fall into Allied hands. At that time, an incredible number of ships had indeed gathered at Scapa Flow. Additionally, the USS Texas had the honor of escorting U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who departed from America for Europe in 1918 to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Although President Wilson himself was transported by the presidential liner George Washington, the USS Texas was part of the escort that ensured the safety of this important voyage. it returned to the United States on November 14th. During the interwar period, the USS Texas continued active service. It underwent a series of modernizations and was frequently used as a training ship, undertaking voyages in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In 1937, it was permanently redeployed to the east coast of the United States and later departed for Europe, becoming the flagship of the Atlantic Squadron shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War. However, at that time, it is important to understand that the battleship, despite its power, was already considered obsolete. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, the USS Texas, being in the Atlantic Ocean, could not remain uninvolved. It performed vital escort duties, protecting convoys bound for Iceland, especially against the threat posed by ships such as the German battleship Bismarck. Its presence in the Atlantic was key to deterring potential enemy attacks. Training operations followed, but the true war for the United States began with the attack on Pearl Harbor. At that time, the USS Texas was based in Newfoundland and remained in the North Atlantic for the first year of American involvement in the war until the autumn of 1942. It was then, as the sole American ship, that it participated in Operation Torch, a large-scale amphibious landing and the capture of French colonies in North Africa, such as Morocco and Algeria. The USS Texas performed its task admirably, shelling coastal fortifications and roads, demonstrating the high effectiveness of its artillery. In 1943-1944, it continued to perform routine but critically important convoy escort duties across the Atlantic. When the details for the opening of the Second Front began to be developed, the USS Texas, along with the USS New York, USS Nevada, and USS Arkansas, was designated to participate in this grandiose operation. These battleships were to become part of Operation Neptune, the naval phase of Operation Overlord, the Allied landings in Normandy. On May 31st, to maintain the utmost secrecy, the ship moved away from shore, and the captain opened a sealed envelope containing the final orders. On June 3rd, the USS Texas weighed anchor and set sail for the coast of Normandy. Upon arriving in Normandy, the USS Texas operated in one of the most difficult landing sectors. Although all sectors were battlegrounds for fierce fighting, on Omaha Beach, where the USS Texas provided fire support, American forces suffered terrible losses, reaching up to 80% of the landing party. Interestingly, Ernest Hemingway was on board at this time and later described the USS Texas as an incredible giant. Indeed, despite its age and certain obsolescence, the battleship impressed with its size and power. However, during the shelling of the Normandy coast, a problem arose. The standard firing range of the USS Texas proved insufficient to hit targets inland. The ship's captain, demonstrating ingenuity, ordered a portion of the torpedo bulges on one side to be flooded. This caused the battleship to list and significantly increase the elevation angle of its guns, allowing it to effectively hit targets at a greater distance. Having completed its fire support mission during the Normandy landings, the battleship Texas departed through the Panama Canal in November 1944, heading for the Pacific Ocean. Although there were already numerous battleships and significant forces there, it was decided to send the Texas as well. On December 13th, it arrived in Pearl Harbor, where it was repainted in the standard dark blue camouflage of the United States Navy, known as Measure 21. Afterwards, in February of the following year, it departed for Iwo Jima to commence fire support for amphibious operations. This is precisely what it did: continuous bombardment. The USS Texas provided fire support during operations at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, performing its job extraordinarily successfully. It was during this period, while shelling these islands, that it fired the greatest number of main-caliber shells in its entire service history. For example, during the operation at Okinawa, the USS Texas continuously shelled the enemy for 7 weeks. During this time, it fired an astonishing 2,019 main-caliber shells. This is truly a huge number. But here is what is truly interesting and worth mentioning. After Normandy, the USS Texas shelled the German Gambier battery nearby. This was the only instance in its entire service during both World Wars when the ship sustained battle damage. The German battery managed to score 2 hits. One of the shells penetrated the conning tower, but fortunately the captain survived. Of course, the USS Texas retaliated by completely destroying the battery, but the ship itself suffered serious damage. However, this did not prevent it from continuing its service, heading towards Japan. Throughout its amazing service, the USS Texas earned 5 battle stars for Operations Torch, Overlord, and Dragon, as well as for the campaigns at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. 5 stars may not be a record, but they demonstrate that this battleship saw action on all key fronts of the Second World War. Of course, after the cessation of hostilities, the USS Texas also participated in Operation Magic Carpet. For this, its crew was reduced, as the ship's task was to transport American veterans home. But after all these missions were completed, it became absolutely obvious. When the United States had such modern and powerful battleships as the Iowa class, which served until the 1990s, why would they need the old USS Texas? It is quite possible that its fate would have been similar to that of the British battleship HMS Warspite. Despite the Warspite being one of Britain's most respected and decorated ships, having traversed all oceans and wars, it was, unfortunately, simply sent to the scrap heap. Just imagine, a huge battleship, a witness to 2 world wars instead of going to the scrap heap, becomes a floating museum. And this is not just any ship, but the USS Texas, one of the most famous dreadnoughts in the history of the United States. After the war, when most such ships awaited a sad fate, the U.S. government demonstrated remarkable foresight. They offered states the opportunity to purchase the ships named in their honor. And so, imagine the USS Texas, named after perhaps the largest state, Texas, received such a chance. On October the 27th, 1945, on Navy Day, approximately 30,000 people gathered aboard the USS Texas. This event captured the attention of the Texas state authorities, and they decided this ship must be saved. Ultimately, it was purchased for $225,000 US and installed for permanent mooring. On April the 21st, 1948, on the anniversary of Texas independence, an official representative of the U.S. Navy, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, incidentally a native of Houston, Texas, where the ship is actually located, delivered a speech. From that day forward, the USS Texas officially became a memorial and museum. It remained in its location until the mid-1980s. Then it was sent for a major overhaul, and frankly, this repair continues to this day. Huge funds were allocated for it. The ship was pulled out of the mud as it had sunk almost up to the waterline. Numerous parts were replaced, many new components were installed, and the hull plating was renewed where it had rotted or rusted. And so, on July the 26th, 1990, the USS Texas returned to its river mooring spot, renovated, almost unrecognizable. So as of today, it is not just a unique, but the only dreadnought remaining in the world. Yes, there are older ships from that era, but a dreadnought like the USS Texas is something you can see for yourself. It successfully operates as a museum in the state of Texas, where all interested parties can visit 7 days a week. If you happen to be passing through, be sure to stop by. This is such a fascinating story about a ship that managed to avoid oblivion. I hope you found it interesting to learn more about the USS Texas. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to watch other historical videos on the channel. That's all for today. Until next time.